Hello Earth-friendly viewers. On today's program, Professor Barry Brook from the University of Adelaide, Australia, discusses the impact of the livestock industry on the environment. Professor Brook is an international research leader in global ecology and conservation biology. He holds the Foundation Sir Hubert Wilkins Chair of Climate Change and is Director of the Research Institute for Climate Change and Sustainability at the University of Adelaide. He has published 2 books and over 100 scientific papers on various aspects of human impacts on the natural environment and biodiversity. He has been awarded the Australian Academy of Science Fenner Medal, Edgeworth David Medal by the Royal Society of New South Wales and the H.G. Andrew Arthur Medal by the Royal Society of South Australia. Professor Brook was listed by Cosmos as one of Australia's top 10 young scientists. Professor Brook emphasises the need to recognise methane as a major contributor of greenhouse gases.
Methane is an interesting greenhouse gas. Many people may not have heard of it, but it's actually the second most powerful greenhouse gas in terms of humans' total contribution to climate change. So everyone's probably heard of CO2. Well, methane is another greenhouse gas that has a large impact, and it's especially important over shorter time periods. So methane is produced mainly by ruminant animals, and also it's released from fossil fuel reserves such as coal mines and gas fields. Those fires that we see at the top of an oil well, for instance, that's the flaring of methane. So methane is actually natural gas too that we would burn to heat water and so on. I've done some work recently with a couple of colleagues showing that in fact Australia's contribution to global warming is more to do with methane, at least in the short term, than it is with anything else. And even more than that, it's more to do with methane produced by ruminant animals, so cattle and sheep and goats, for instance. As part of their natural digestion process, they produce methane. They chew the cud, they have a second stomach, and inside that stomach there's bacteria that break down cellulose in grass to release energy. Well, that's a process that's known as an anaerobic process, so it's in the absence of oxygen, and that process causes the release of methane, mostly through belching. Now, because it's such a powerful greenhouse gas, it has a disproportionate effect on climate change. But most of its impact occurs over a fairly brief period of time, 10 or 20 years. Almost all the methane's gone. But if you look over that time period, then for every tonne of methane that's released, that's the equivalent to releasing 72 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So it packs a big punch. So to put that in context, Australia's cattle industry, livestock industry, cattle and sheep, currently releases about 3 million tonnes, thereabouts, of methane per year. Whereas our coal-fired power stations release about 180 million tonnes of CO2. So it sounds like coal-fired power stations contribute much more than our cattle do to global warming. But if you think that methane packs 72 times the punch of CO2 over a 20-year period, then over those next 2 decades, you multiply 3 by 72. Pretty easy to work out that our cattle and sheep industry actually contributes more to global warming than our coal-fired power stations over that period. So that's a vastly underappreciated fact in Australia.
Do you think that methane is underappreciated in our recent submissions to the government?
Yeah, I think that's quite apparent. If you look at different greenhouse gases, they have a different contribution to global warming. So you need some method of standardising them. Now, the basic method that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses is to average everything over a 100-year period. Yeah. But for methane, that's actually a bit pointless because it's almost all gone after about 20 years. So you've taken all of its short-term contribution and smeared that out over 100 years to make it much less than it would otherwise be. So if you look at these reports, they'll suggest it has about 25 times the impact of CO2. But really, when it's up there in the atmosphere doing its work, it's 72 times the impact. And that makes a big difference. So I think it's underappreciated in those reports because of that accounting problem. And perhaps also because it's a problem a lot of people don't want to face. If we want to be serious about our emissions reductions, we have to account for agricultural emissions, and we have to, most importantly, account for Australia's greatest contribution in the short term to global warming, and that's methane.
So if we were to, have an effect on the animal agriculture, phase it out, would that buy us time with the CO2 technologies?
Yeah, because methane has a very powerful effect but a short-term effect, ironically you can do something about it pretty quickly compared to CO2. So although it's really important right now, it's something we can really purge out of our emissions very quickly. So for reasons disconnected with climate change, for instance, Australia's sheep population declined from about 190 million to less than 100 million since 1992. That's had a large impact on Australia's methane emissions. So it gives you an example of how quickly we can make that change, basically halved the emissions produced by Australia's sheep. There's no reason why you can't do that for cattle as well. Whereas to change over society's infrastructure, for instance from coal-fired power stations to alternative forms of energy, whilst that needs to happen very quickly, it requires a large turnover of capital infrastructure, things which tend to be, I think, economically more intractable, whereas reducing the head of cattle in Australia is something that could be done quickly, just over a couple of years, and have a huge impact on our global warming impact.
When Planet Earth, Our Loving Home returns, Professor Barry Brook will impart his latest research findings on meat consumption's greenhouse gas emissions. Please stay tuned to Supreme Master Television. You're watching Planet Earth, Our Loving Home on Supreme Master Television. On today's show, Professor Barry Brook from the University of Adelaide, Australia, explains the role livestock raising plays on climate change.
I'd like to talk to you, Barry, about the review that you did with Jeff Russell it's called Meat's Carbon Footprint. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this was a study we did which looked at the relative impact of eating beef on a family's CO2 emissions compared to some of their other activities that most people might suspect would have a much greater contribution to global warming. So the example we used was, let's say you had a large four-wheel drive vehicle, a Ford Territory, so that cost about 17 tonnes of CO2 emissions to build the thing, and then to run it each week it might be about 200 grams of CO2 per kilometre driven. So you can make the calculation on that basis. It might be 60 kilograms of CO2 a week that you're using to drive this lumbering Ford Territory around, as well as the emissions that went into producing it. If you eat what the CSIRO Total Wellbeing Diet recommends is the average weekly consumption of beef, which is somewhere between 3 to 5 kilograms, then you find that when you do the calculations for methane, even when it's using the standard, which is 25 times as powerful as CO2, and remember earlier I said really we should be talking about 72 times as powerful, but even at 25 times as powerful, that would be releasing about 200 kilograms a week compared to 60 from your Ford Territory. So you only need to go for about 5 years cutting out that meat of your diet, and you've paid for the emissions of that great four-wheel drive. So that's one example. Another way to look at it is the amount of emissions produced by a kilogram of steak. That's so emissions intensive in terms of methane that it's the equivalent to 4 times the emissions that would be released by producing a kilogram of aluminium, which is considered incredibly energy intensive and using a lot of electricity to actually produce that aluminium by electrolysis. So beef 4 times more than producing a kilogram of aluminium, beef being much more of a contributor than driving a four-wheel drive vehicle. These are facts which are greatly underappreciated. So that means you need to be climate conscious about your diet, because there are some impacts in your lifestyle that will have a much greater effect on global warming than others, and people don't actually understand what they are.
And in relation to water that they use to grow beef, there's a lot of water used in that regard. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, indeed. There's a lot of water goes into producing a kilogram of beef, and a lot of water also goes into producing dairy products. So much dairy in Australia is conducted on lands that that wouldn't actually be suitable for dairy except for irrigated agriculture. So this is water that's piped from the Murray and sprayed over vast areas of pasture to produce sufficiently green pasture to produce good milk. But that's the same water that's in desperate short supply in Adelaide. It's killing the Coorong, for instance, because it's not getting enough water flow. These are being sprayed onto the green fields of Western Victoria to produce dairy. It's not actually a very sensible use of water at all. So I think people have to look at the total impact of livestock to really appreciate why they can be particularly damaging to global change. And indeed, looking further afield than Australia, to the tropics, one of the major drivers of tropical deforestation, which in itself is responsible for about 20% or a fifth of all of human CO2 emissions, is driven by clearance of tropical forest for cattle grazing. So again, it's a driver of deforestation, causes CO2 emissions directly by chopping down and burning, mostly burning those trees, and then once the cattle are there, producing a whole lot more methane as well. So there's no doubt that livestock have a long shadow, and indeed that was the title of a report produced by the United Nations last year, looking at the total impact of livestock on global change. It's pretty profound and it's pretty pervasive.
Do you think that our government should be doing more as regards to letting people know about how they can act as individuals to help with our planetary crisis?
I think leaving agriculture out of the equation sends the wrong signal, because it exempts a sector of society from making greenhouse gas cuts when in fact every sector of society needs to contribute, so it's just moving the burden to other parts of society. And it's not rightfully acknowledging the impact, the environmental impact that ruminant animals have on Australia. People often talk about climate change as having a long-term impact and what it's going to do by the end of the century. And yet we're observing impacts such as the loss of Arctic summer sea ice, an expansion of tropical weather systems, very intense droughts in sub-Saharan Africa and indeed in Australia. The sort of impacts we predicted for 20, 30, 50, 100 years off are occurring now. And there's also a great risk that we're going to cross what are known as tipping points in the Earth system, where we start to get runaway climate change, or at least climate change that's greatly accelerated by changes to the Earth system. We're at a crucial social tipping point and a crucial environmental tipping point right now. Now is the time to take action. It's urgent.
We thank Professor Brook for his important research and work to help restore our planet's ecosystem. Caring viewers, it was a pleasure to have you join us for today's Planet Earth, Our Loving Home. Our show airs every Wednesday on Supreme Master Television. Up next, stay tuned for enlightening entertainment right after noteworthy news. We wish you a blessed life filled with divine love and inner peace.